I learned to survive on silence and solitude, believing I would never again know the warmth of human kindness. But on the coldest night of that brutal winter, the very man who had judged me most harshly stood trembling at my door, and in his eyes I saw something I had never expected to find: the desperate need to be saved. My name is Honoria Ashworth, and this is the story of how I lost everything, found myself, and discovered that love can bloom even in the most frozen of hearts. The scandal began, as most scandals do, with whispers. My husband Phineas had been dead barely a fortnight when the first rumors reached my ears. I was still wearing my mourning veil, still clutching his handkerchief as though it might bring him back to me, when Lady Euphemia Blackwood cornered me at the funeral reception and asked, with poison dripping from every syllable, whether it was true that I had hastened my dear husband's departure from this world. I remember the way the teacup trembled in my hand. I remember the heat that rose to my cheeks and the cold that spread through my chest. I remember thinking that, surely this was some terrible misunderstanding that would be corrected by morning. But morning brought only more whispers, and the whispers grew into accusations, and the accusations became a verdict, delivered not by any court of law, but by something far more powerful and far less merciful, the court of public opinion. Phineas had been a gentle soul, a man whose constitution had always been delicate, whose lungs had been weakened by a childhood illness that left him perpetually breathless. I had married him knowing he was not long for this world. I had married him because he was kind, because he made me laugh, because he saw me as a person when so many others saw only my modest dowry and unremarkable family name. We had 3 years together, 3 years of quiet contentment, of books read aloud by the fire, of walks in the garden when his health permitted, of conversations that stretched long into the night. When he died, I thought the worst had already happened. I was wrong. The Ashworth family had never approved of me. His mother, the Dowager Duchess Theodora, had made it abundantly clear from the moment of our engagement that I was beneath her son, that I was a fortune hunter despite my fortune being nearly non-existent, that I had somehow bewitched her innocent boy into an unsuitable match. When Phineas died, leaving me the modest inheritance he had set aside against his family's wishes, the Dowager saw her opportunity. It was she who planted the seeds of the poison rumor. It was she who suggested to Lady Blackwood that perhaps my husband's death had not been entirely natural. It was she who reminded society that I had been alone with Phineas in his final hours, that I had prepared his evening tea, that I had been the one to discover his lifeless body in the morning. None of it was true, of course. Phineas had died peacefully in his sleep, his weak heart finally surrendering to the strain it had carried all his life. The physician who examined him said as much. But physicians could be bought, the Dowager whispered. Physicians could be persuaded to keep secrets. Within a month, I was ruined. The invitations stopped coming. Old friends crossed the street to avoid me. Shopkeepers who had once greeted me warmly now served me with cold efficiency and visible reluctance. I was not arrested, for there was no evidence of any crime. I was not tried, for there was no case to be made. But I was condemned nonetheless, sentenced to a life of isolation and shame by the unwritten laws of society. The final blow came when the Dowager's solicitor arrived at my door with papers that made my head spin. The Ashworth estate, he explained, was entailed. The house I had shared with Phineas, the furnishings, the carriages, the horses, all of it belonged to the next male heir. And that heir was Phineas's older brother, the Duke Benedict Ashworth, a man I had met only twice, and who had regarded me on both occasions with the same expression one might reserve for something unpleasant discovered on the bottom of one's shoe. I was given 1 week to vacate the premises. I was permitted to take my personal effects, my clothing, and the small sum of money Phineas had left me in a separate account, money the family had been unable to contest despite their best efforts. It was enough to survive on, barely. It was not enough to start over. I considered returning to my childhood home, But my parents had passed years ago, and the estate had been sold to pay their debts. I considered seeking refuge with my sister Lavinia, but she had married a vicar in Cornwall and had written to say that while she loved me dearly, her husband's congregation would not look kindly on a suspected murderess living in their parsonage. I considered simply disappearing, finding some remote corner of the world where the name Ashworth meant nothing, and beginning again as someone new. In the end, I chose something simpler. I chose the gamekeeper's cottage. It sat at the very edge of the Ashworth estate, a small stone structure that had been abandoned when the previous gamekeeper retired and no replacement was hired. It was technically on ducal land, but it was so far from the main house, so hidden among the trees and hills of the northern wilderness, that I doubted the Duke even knew it existed. I had discovered it during one of my walks with Phineas, on a rare day when his health had permitted a longer excursion. He had spoken of it fondly, remembering childhood adventures with the old gamekeeper, a man named Septimus who had taught him to fish and to identify birds by their songs. I arrived at the cottage on a gray November afternoon, my worldly possessions reduced to 2 trunks and a carpet-bag. The building was in worse condition than I remembered, the roof patched in places, the windows clouded with years of grime, the garden overrun with weeds that had turned brown and brittle with the approaching winter. But the walls were solid, the chimney was intact, and when I pushed open the door, I found that the interior, while dusty and cold, was fundamentally sound. I spent my first week making the cottage habitable. I scrubbed the floors until my hands were raw. I cleaned the windows until they sparkled. I beat the dust from the old curtains and laid fires in every room to drive out the damp that had settled into the walls. I found an old bed frame in the smaller bedroom and purchased a mattress from a farmer's wife in the nearby village, a woman who looked at me curiously but asked no questions about why a lady of obvious breeding was setting up house in a gamekeeper's cottage. The villagers were kind to me, perhaps because they were far enough from London society to have escaped the worst of the gossip. Perhaps because they judged people by their actions rather than their reputations. The blacksmith, a broad-shouldered man named Cornelius, fixed the broken latch on my door and refused payment. The baker's wife, a round-cheeked woman named Rosalind, began setting aside a fresh loaf for me each morning. The elderly apothecary, whose name was Theophilus and whose spectacles were perpetually sliding down his nose, recommended remedies for the cold I developed during my first month and told me stories of the gamekeeper Septimus, who had been his closest friend. I settled into a quiet routine. I woke with the sun, lit the fire, made tea. I spent my mornings reading the books I had brought from London. The few volumes I had been permitted to take from the library, Phineas and I had built together. I spent my afternoons walking the hills, learning the landscape, discovering hidden streams and ancient standing stones and copses of birch trees that glowed silver in the winter light. I spent my evenings by the fire, writing in my journal, trying to make sense of the life I had lived and the life that stretched before me. I was lonely. I will not pretend otherwise. There were nights when the wind howled outside my windows, and I would have given anything to hear another human voice, to feel the weight of a hand in mine. But there was also a strange peace in my solitude, a freedom I had never known. I answered to no one. I followed no schedule but my own. I was finally, for the first time in my life, truly alone with myself, and I discovered that I was better company than I had ever imagined. The first winter storm arrived in late December. I had been warned by Cornelius that the winters in this part of the country could be brutal, and I had spent the preceding weeks preparing as best I could. I had laid in supplies of food and firewood. I had patched the drafty spots in the walls with rags and old newspapers. I had acquired a thick woolen blanket from a traveling peddler and a pair of sturdy boots from the cobbler in the village. Even so, I was not prepared for the ferocity of that storm. It began as a light snowfall, the kind of picturesque dusting that makes the countryside look like an illustration in a book of fairy tales. But by nightfall, the wind had risen to a shriek, and the snow had become a blinding wall of white. I sat by my fire, watching the flames dance, listening to the cottage groan and creak under the assault of the wind, and I felt a curious mixture of fear and exhilaration. This was nature at its most powerful, and I was surviving it. I was warm, I was safe, I was alone but not helpless. The storm raged for 3 days. On the 4th morning, I woke to silence and stepped outside to find a world transformed. The snow was nearly to my waist, drifts piled high against walls and fences, the familiar landscape rendered strange and beautiful by its white covering. The sun had emerged, and every surface sparkled with a brilliance that hurt my eyes. I spent the morning digging a path from my door to the woodpile, grateful for the foresight that had led me to stack the wood under a covered lean-to. I was so absorbed in my work that I did not notice the figure approaching until he was nearly upon me. He was tall and gaunt, wrapped in a snow-covered greatcoat, his face half hidden by a scarf that was stiff with ice. He moved slowly, as if each step required enormous effort, and when he finally reached the edge of my path, he stopped and stared at me with eyes that I recognized despite their reddened, exhausted state. It was the Duke Benedict Ashworth. I did not move. I did not speak. I simply stood there, my shovel in my hands, the cold biting at my exposed cheeks, and watched as the man who had turned me out of my home, the man whose family had destroyed my reputation, the man who had inherited everything that should have been my future, struggled to remain upright in the snow outside my door. His lips moved, but no sound emerged. He swayed, caught himself, swayed again. And then, to my utter astonishment, he fell to his knees. I should have left him there. I should have closed my door and let the cold do its work. He had shown me no mercy when I was at my most vulnerable. Why should I extend any to him? But even as these thoughts passed through my mind, I was already moving toward him. I was already reaching for his arm, already hauling him upright with a strength I did not know I possessed. I was already guiding him through my door, already settling him before my fire, already pulling the frozen scarf from his face and the icy gloves from his hands. He looked at me with something like confusion, as if he could not quite comprehend why I was helping him, as if he had expected to be turned away and was not sure how to respond to my unexpected kindness. I brought him hot tea, the last of my good china rattling against the saucer because my hands were trembling. I brought him blankets, the thick woolen one from my bed and the quilts I had made myself during the long autumn evenings. I brought him soup, a simple broth I had prepared the day before, and watched as he drank it in small, careful sips. He did not speak for a long time. Neither did I. We simply sat there, the Duke and the outcast, the master and the exile, while the fire crackled between us and the silence stretched into something almost comfortable. Finally, he spoke. His voice was hoarse, roughened by cold and something else I could not name. Thank you. 2 words, simple words. But they hung in the air between us like something fragile and precious, and I found that I could not look away from his face. He was not handsome in the conventional sense. His features were too sharp, too severe, marked by deep lines around his eyes and a permanent furrow between his brows. His hair, which had once been dark, was threaded with silver at the temples. His eyes were the color of winter slate, gray and cold and guarded. But there was something in those eyes, something that flickered beneath the frost, that made me pause. I knew the stories about him. Everyone did. The Duke of Ashworth was a man who had built walls around himself so high and so thick that no one could penetrate them. He had been engaged once, years ago, to a beautiful young woman named Christabel Fairfax, the daughter of an earl, a match that had been the envy of all society. But Christabel had died of a fever barely a month before the wedding, and something in Benedict had died with her. He had retreated to his estate, emerging only when duty absolutely required it, speaking to no one except when necessary, living a life of such complete isolation that even his own servants rarely saw his face. And now he was here, in my cottage, drinking my tea, wrapped in my blankets, looking at me with eyes that held a question I did not know how to answer. "What happened?" I asked, and my voice sounded strange to my own ears, too loud in the quiet room. He was silent for a moment, and I thought he might not answer. But then he spoke, and his words came slowly, as if each one cost him something. "The storm," he said. "It was worse at the castle than anyone expected. The pipes froze, then they burst. The water damage was extensive, and the cold." He paused, his jaw tightening. The fireplaces could not keep up. The servants fled when the situation became untenable. I tried to manage alone, but he trailed off, and I understood what he was not saying. He had nearly died. The great Duke of Ashworth, master of one of the finest estates in England, had nearly frozen to death in his own home because he was too proud, too stubborn, too alone to ask for help before it was almost too late. "How did you find me?" I asked. "I saw the light," he said. "From the hill above, your windows, the only light in miles." I thought about this. My cottage was indeed visible from a certain point on the hills that surrounded the main estate, but it was a considerable distance, and in a blizzard, the journey would have been treacherous beyond measure. "You walked here," I said. "In that storm." He nodded once, a sharp jerk of his head. "You could have died." Another nod. I did not know what to say to this. I did not know what to make of a man who would risk death rather than remain in a castle that had become a tomb of ice. I did not know what to think about the fact that he had come to me, of all people, the woman his family had destroyed. "You should rest," I said finally. "There is a bed in the other room. I will bring more blankets." He looked as if he wanted to protest, but exhaustion won the battle with pride. He allowed me to help him to the small bedroom, allowed me to pile quilts and blankets upon him until he was buried beneath a mountain of fabric. And then, with a sigh that seemed to come from somewhere deep within his chest, he closed his eyes and slept. I sat by his bedside for a long time that night, watching the firelight play across his face, wondering what strange twist of fate had brought us to this moment. The man who had inherited my husband's title and fortune. The woman who had been cast out to make way for his claim. And now here we were, thrown together by a storm, bound by the simple necessity of survival. I did not know then what the coming days would bring. I did not know that this was only the beginning. I did not know that my life was about to change in ways I could never have imagined. But as I watched him sleep, I felt something stir in my heart. Not love, not yet, but something else. Something that might have been curiosity. Something that might have been hope. And for the first time since Phineas had died, I allowed myself to wonder if perhaps my story was not over after all. The Duke slept for nearly 20 hours. I checked on him periodically, terrified that he might have developed a fever, that the cold might have damaged him in ways that would only become apparent once his body had warmed. But his breathing remained steady. His color gradually improved, and when he finally woke, it was with the abrupt alertness of a man who rarely allows himself the luxury of deep rest. I was in the kitchen, preparing a simple breakfast, when I heard him stirring. I wiped my hands on my apron and went to the doorway of his room, uncertain of what I would find. He was sitting up in bed, looking around the small space with an expression of complete bewilderment. The quilts had fallen to his waist, revealing the rumpled shirt beneath, and his hair stood up in wild disarray. He looked, I thought, nothing like a duke. He looked like a man who had been through an ordeal and was only now beginning to understand that he had survived it. "Good morning," I said. His eyes found me, and I saw the moment when recognition dawned, when memory returned, when he understood where he was and how he had come to be there. "Mrs. Ashworth," he said, and his voice was still rough but stronger than it had been the night before. "Your Grace," I replied. We stared at each other across the small room, and I was acutely aware of the strangeness of our situation. This man was my brother-in-law, at least in the eyes of the law. He was also the man who had signed the papers that had turned me out of my home. He was the head of the family that had accused me of murder. And now he was sitting in my bed, in my cottage, looking at me with an expression I could not quite decipher. "I should go," he said, and he began to push back the blankets. "Do not be absurd," I said, the words coming out more sharply than I intended. "The snow is still deep, and you are in no condition to travel. You will stay until you have recovered your strength and the roads have cleared." He looked at me with something that might have been surprise. I suppose he was not accustomed to being spoken to in such a manner. But I was no longer a society wife, mindful of her place and her manners. I was a woman who had survived alone through a brutal winter, and I was not about to let a man die of stubbornness in my cottage. "Besides," I added, somewhat more gently, "I have made breakfast. It would be a shame to waste it." Something flickered in his eyes. Not quite a smile, but something close to it. "Very well," he said, "if you insist." "I do," I said, and I turned back to the kitchen before he could see the flush that had risen to my cheeks. That first breakfast was awkward, as one might expect. We sat across from each other at my small table, eating eggs and toast in a silence that was punctuated only by the clink of cutlery and the crackle of the fire. I did not know what to say to him, and he seemed equally at a loss. We were strangers, despite our connection by marriage. We were enemies, despite his current dependence on my hospitality. But as the days passed, as the snow slowly began to melt, and the world outside my windows transformed from white to gray to the pale brown of winter mud, something began to shift between us. It started with small things: a question about the book I was reading, a comment about the quality of the tea, an observation about the weather that led to a longer conversation about the harshness of northern winters compared to the milder climate of London. I learned that he had been educated at Oxford, where he had studied classics and philosophy. I learned that he spoke 3 languages fluently and could read 2 more. I learned that he had traveled extensively in his youth, visiting Italy and Greece and Egypt, and that he had once harbored dreams of becoming an archaeologist before duty had called him back to England and the responsibilities of his title. He learned, in turn, about my more modest education, the governess who had taught me to love poetry, the father who had encouraged my curiosity even when society frowned upon women who thought too deeply. He learned about my marriage to Phineas, about the quiet happiness we had shared, about the grief that still caught me unawares at unexpected moments. We did not speak of the scandal. We did not speak of the accusations that had been leveled against me, or the role his family had played in my destruction. It was as if we had made an unspoken agreement to set aside the past, at least for now, and to meet each other as we were in this present moment. 2 people stranded together by circumstances beyond their control. But I thought about it. Of course I did. I thought about it every time he looked at me with those guarded gray eyes. I thought about it every time our hands accidentally brushed when he passed me a cup or I handed him a book. I thought about it in the long hours of the night when I lay in my bed, now restored to me since he had moved to a pallet by the fire, and listened to the sound of his breathing in the next room. On the 5th day, the roads finally cleared enough for travel. I woke to find him standing by the window, staring out at the landscape with an expression I could not read. "You could go back now," I said, and my voice sounded strange, even to my own ears. "If you wished." He did not turn around. He did not move at all. "Yes," he said, "I could." But he did not go. Not that day, and not the next. He made excuses that I did not believe, citing concerns about the stability of the main house, the need to ensure that the repairs were proceeding properly before he took up residence again. But I saw the way his shoulders relaxed when I did not press him to leave. I saw the way his eyes followed me as I moved about my daily tasks. On the 7th day, he finally spoke of the thing we had both been avoiding. "I need to ask you something," he said. We were sitting by the fire after dinner, the comfortable silence that had become our habit stretching between us. I had a book in my lap, though I had not turned a page in nearly an hour. He was staring into the flames, his profile sharp and severe in the firelight. "Ask?" I said. "Did you?" he began, and then stopped. He pressed his lips together, as if the words were physically difficult to speak. Did you harm my brother? I should have been angry. I should have been outraged that he would ask such a thing after everything I had done for him. But looking at his face, at the genuine torment I saw there, I found that I could not summon any anger at all. This was a man who had lost the woman he loved, who had then lost his younger brother, who was surrounded by family members whispering poison in his ear. This was a man who desperately wanted to believe in something good and was terrified of being disappointed. No, I said simply, I did not. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I met his gaze without flinching. Phineas died in his sleep, I said. His heart gave out. The physician confirmed it. There was never any evidence to the contrary, because there was nothing to find. I loved your brother. I would never have hurt him. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. I believe you, he said finally. I felt something loosen in my chest, some knot that had been tied since the day the first rumors reached my ears. I had not realized how much I needed someone to believe me. I had not realized how much weight I had been carrying, the burden of being judged and condemned by everyone who had once claimed to care for me. Thank you, I whispered. He shook his head. Do not thank me. I should have believed you from the beginning. I should have investigated the matter myself instead of accepting my mother's version of events. I should have. He broke off, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration. You should have what? I prompted gently. I should have been a better man, he said. I should have protected you. You were my brother's widow. You were family. And I let them destroy you because it was easier than asking questions. I was quiet for a long moment, considering his words. Why did you? I asked. Why did you believe them? He was silent for so long that I thought he might not answer. But finally, he spoke, and his voice was so low I had to lean forward to hear him. Because I was angry, he said, at Phineas, for dying, for leaving me alone with this title I never wanted and these responsibilities I never asked for. He paused, his jaw tightening. And I was angry at you, for making him happy in a way I could not, for being the one he chose to spend his final years with, for having what I had lost. I did not understand at first, but then the pieces fell into place, and I drew in a sharp breath. Christabel, I said softly. He flinched at the name, and I saw the pain that crossed his face before he could hide it. I loved her, he said, more than I have ever loved anything or anyone in my life. When she died, I told myself that I would never feel that way again. I closed off my heart. I built walls. And when I saw you with Phineas, saw the way you looked at each other, the way you laughed together, I could not bear it. It reminded me of everything I had lost. So you let your mother's lies stand, I said, because it was easier to hate me than to feel. Yes, he said, and the word was barely more than a breath. Yes, I should have been angry. Part of me was angry, a hot coal of resentment that had been smoldering in my chest for months. But looking at him, at this broken man who had hidden behind walls of ice for so long that he had forgotten how to feel anything at all, I found that my anger was not as strong as my compassion. I know something of loss, I said quietly. I know what it is to build walls around your heart. I know what it is to be so afraid of feeling pain that you choose numbness instead. He looked at me, and in his eyes I saw something I had never seen before. Vulnerability, raw, unguarded vulnerability. How do you bear it? He asked. How do you go on? I thought about my answer carefully. I do not know that I do, I said finally. I do not know that there is any secret to bearing grief. You simply wake each day and put one foot in front of the other. You find small joys where you can. You learn to live with the empty places, to make room for them without letting them consume you. And does it get easier? He asked. No, I said honestly. It does not get easier, but it becomes more familiar. You learn to carry it differently. The weight does not lessen, but you become stronger." He was silent, processing my words. And then slowly, tentatively, he reached out and took my hand. "I could teach you," I said, surprising even myself, "if you wished. How to live again." He looked down at our joined hands, at my small fingers wrapped in his larger ones. And when he looked up again, there was something new in his eyes, something that might have been hope. "I think," he said slowly, "I would like that." The days that followed were strange and wonderful. The Duke did not return to the main house. Instead, he sent word to his steward that he was overseeing repairs from a distance and would return when the situation was resolved. It was a thin excuse, and I suspected that his household staff knew the truth. But no one came to investigate. We fell into a rhythm, he and I. We took our meals together, simple fare that I prepared with increasing confidence as my cooking skills improved. We read aloud to each other in the evenings, taking turns with the books from my small collection. We walked the hills when the weather permitted, he pointing out features of the landscape he remembered from childhood, I sharing the discoveries I had made during my solitary explorations. He told me about Christabel. It took time, the story emerging in fragments over many conversations, but eventually I learned the whole of it. They had met at a ball when he was 23 and she was 19. She had been beautiful, he said, with dark hair and laughing eyes, but it was her spirit that had captured him, her fearlessness, her joy in life. They had been engaged for nearly a year when the fever struck. She had been ill for only a week before she died. He had been at her bedside at the end, holding her hand as she slipped away. Afterward, he had become the man the world knew, cold, distant, untouchable. He had taken his grief and his rage and his despair, and he had locked them away behind walls so thick that even he could not penetrate them. He had devoted himself to duty, to the management of his estates, to the endless responsibilities of his title. He had convinced himself that this was enough, that this hollow half-life was all he deserved. "Until the storm," he said one evening, his voice quiet in the fire-lit room, "until I found myself freezing in a castle that had become a tomb, and I realized that I did not want to die. Not like that, not alone." "You are not alone now," I said. "No," he agreed, looking at me with those gray eyes that no longer seemed cold. "I am not." It was not a declaration of love. It was too soon for such things, and we both knew it. But it was something, an acknowledgement, a beginning. Spring came slowly to the northern hills. The snow retreated inch by inch, revealing the brown grass beneath, and then the first green shoots began to appear. Crocuses pushed through the half-frozen soil, and the birds returned, filling the mornings with song. The Duke finally returned to his castle, but not in the way I had expected. He did not simply pack his things and leave with a polite farewell. Instead, he asked if I would accompany him, to see the progress of the repairs and to offer my opinion on certain matters of decoration. "I do not know anything about decorating castles," I said, somewhat bewildered by the request. "Neither do I," he admitted, "which is precisely why I need your help." So I went. For the first time since Phineas's death, I stepped onto the grounds of the Ashworth estate, walked through the halls that had once been my home, and entered the main house that I had been barred from entering ever again. The damage from the frozen pipes had been extensive, just as the Duke had described. Entire rooms had been flooded, the water seeping into walls and floors and causing destruction that would take months to repair. But the work was proceeding well, and as we walked through the house, I found myself offering suggestions without thinking. This wall should be painted a warmer color. That carpet should be replaced with something lighter. These curtains block too much light. The Duke listened to everything I said, nodding thoughtfully, occasionally asking questions. And when we had finished our tour, he turned to me with an expression I could not read. "Would you consider," he began, and then stopped. He seemed to be struggling with something, fighting some internal battle. Would you consider staying here, not at the cottage, but at the house, as my guest?" I stared at him, uncertain I had heard correctly. "Your guest," I repeated. "Yes." He paused, then added, somewhat awkwardly, "We could continue our conversations, our readings, our walks, only with more comfortable accommodations." "What would people say?" I asked. "The Duke of Ashworth, hosting the woman accused of murdering his brother?" "Let them say what they like," he said, and there was a fierce determination in his voice that I had never heard before. "I am tired of living my life according to what other people think. I am tired of letting fear and propriety dictate my choices. You are not a murderess. You are a woman who was wrongly accused and cruelly punished, and I intend to make that right." "How?" I asked. "By restoring your reputation," he said. "By making it clear to everyone that I believe in your innocence. By showing the world that the Ashworth family was wrong to condemn you." I was speechless. This was more than I had ever dared to hope for. This was justice or something approaching it. "And if I refuse?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Then I will continue to visit you at the cottage," he said, "as often as you will have me. But I hope you will not refuse." He took a step closer, his eyes searching my face. "I have spent 10 years running from anything that might make me feel again. I do not wish to run anymore." I looked at him, this man who had once been my enemy and had somehow become something else entirely. I thought of all the reasons I should refuse. I thought of the scandal it would cause, the whispers that would follow, the difficulty of rebuilding a reputation that had been so thoroughly destroyed. And then I thought of the alternative, returning to my cottage, living alone, watching him walk away and wondering what might have been. "Very well," I said, "I will stay, but as your equal, not your charity case. I will not be pitied or patronized." The smile that crossed his face was the first genuine smile I had ever seen from him, and it transformed his features entirely. "I would expect nothing less," he said. The return to society was not easy. There were those who refused to accept me, who continued to whisper and point and cross the street when they saw me coming. The Dowager Theodora was chief among them. She made it known to anyone who would listen that her stepson had taken leave of his senses, that he had been bewitched by the same woman who had murdered her son, that the family name was being dragged through the mud. But the Duke was relentless in his defense of me. He wrote letters to the newspapers refuting the accusations. He threatened legal action against those who continued to spread slander. He invited prominent members of society to his home and introduced me as his honored guest, making it clear that any insult to me would be considered an insult to him. Slowly, the tide began to turn. Those who had condemned me most harshly began to reconsider their positions. Those who had been on the fence decided that if the Duke believed in my innocence, perhaps they should too. And those who had secretly doubted the accusations from the beginning finally felt safe to say so publicly. It was not a complete restoration. There would always be those who believed the worst, who clung to scandal because it was more interesting than truth. But for the first time since Phineas's death, I could walk through the streets without feeling the weight of 1,000 accusing eyes. And through it all, the Duke was at my side. Benedict, as I had begun to think of him, though I still called him Your Grace in public, he was my constant companion, my defender, my friend. And something more, though neither of us had yet put a name to it. It happened on a summer evening, 3 months after I had moved into the castle. We were walking in the gardens, the air heavy with the scent of roses, the last light of the sun painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. "There is something I must tell you," he said, stopping beside a fountain that sparkled in the fading light. I waited, my heart suddenly beating faster. "When I came to your cottage that night," he said slowly, "I told you I saw your light from the hill. That was true, but I did not tell you why I was on the hill in the first place." I looked at him puzzled. "I was looking for you," he admitted. "I had been watching your cottage for weeks, telling myself it was curiosity or duty or some other excuse. But the truth is, I could not stop thinking about you, about the wrong I had done you, about the woman who had been cast out because of my family's lies. You were watching me, I said, not quite able to process this information. He nodded, shame coloring his features. I know it sounds, he began. It sounds like you cared, I said softly. Even then, even before you knew me. He was silent for a long moment. I think, he said finally, that I began to care the moment I saw you at your husband's funeral. There was something in your face, something in the way you held yourself. You were so alone and yet so dignified. And I thought, there is a woman of strength. There is a woman of character. And yet you let your mother destroy me, I said, but without bitterness. I was past bitterness now. I was a coward, he said simply. I was afraid of what I might feel if I allowed myself to look too closely, so I looked away. And you suffered for my cowardice. I considered his words. I considered the man before me, so different from the cold and distant Duke I had first encountered. I considered all that we had been through, the long winter in my cottage, the slow rebuilding of trust, the gradual discovery of each other's hearts. I forgive you, I said. He looked at me with an expression of such raw hope that it made my heart ache. I do not deserve your forgiveness, he said. Perhaps not, I agreed, but I give it anyway, because I have learned that carrying resentment is like carrying a stone in your pocket. Eventually, it becomes too heavy to bear, and I am tired of carrying stones. He reached out and took my hand, just as he had done on that winter night so many months ago. But this time, he raised it to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to my fingers. I love you, he said. I know I have no right to say such a thing. I know that after everything my family has done, I should expect nothing from you. But I cannot keep it hidden any longer. I love you, Honoria. I have loved you for longer than I knew. The world seemed to stop. The fountain continued to sparkle. The birds continued to sing. The roses continued to release their fragrance into the evening air. But for a moment, there was nothing but the two of us, standing at the edge of something vast and unknown. I thought of Phineas. I thought of the love we had shared, the quiet contentment of our years together. I thought of how he had always encouraged me to embrace life fully, to take risks, to never let fear hold me back. And I thought of Benedict, of the man he had been and the man he was becoming, of the walls he had built and the courage it had taken to tear them down, of the way he looked at me as if I were something precious and rare. I love you too, I said. He stared at me as if he could not quite believe what he was hearing. You, he began. I love you, I repeated. I did not expect to. I did not want to. But I do. And then he was kissing me, his hands cupping my face, his lips gentle and questioning against mine. It was not the kiss of a cold and distant Duke. It was the kiss of a man who had finally allowed himself to feel again. When we finally drew apart, he rested his forehead against mine and let out a shaky breath. What now? He asked. Now, I said, we live. We were married in the autumn, in the small chapel on the estate grounds. It was a quiet ceremony, attended only by those who had proven themselves true friends. Cornelius the blacksmith, Rosalind the baker's wife, Theophilus the apothecary, and a handful of others who had shown me kindness when I had nothing to offer in return. The Dowager Theodora refused to attend, which was just as well. She had retreated to her dower house, where she continued to hold court over a dwindling circle of like-minded gossips. I did not waste energy on resentment. She was an old woman clinging to old hatreds, and I had better things to do with my time. The wedding night was not what I expected. I had been married before, of course, and I knew what to anticipate in a purely physical sense. But Benedict was different from Phineas in every way. Where Phineas had been gentle and careful, hampered by his fragile health, Benedict was passionate and intense, bringing to our marriage bed the same fervor he brought to everything he cared about. But he was also tender in unexpected ways. He held me close afterward, stroking my hair, whispering words of love and wonder into my ear. He told me that I had given him back his heart, that I had taught him how to live again. And when I woke the next morning, to find him watching me with an expression of such complete adoration, I knew that I had found something rare and precious. Our first year of marriage was a time of healing and discovery. We learned each other's habits and preferences, our quirks and peculiarities. We learned how to argue without cruelty and how to apologize without shame. We learned the particular rhythm of our partnership, the give and take that every marriage requires. Benedict threw himself into the restoration of his estates with renewed energy. He modernized the farming practices, improved housing for his tenants, and established a school for the village children. He told me that he wanted to leave something better than what he had inherited, to build a legacy based on compassion rather than cold duty. I, in turn, found new purpose in managing the household. Not in the traditional way of a duchess, obsessed with parties and social standing, but in a more practical sense. I worked with the cook to improve the meals served to the servants. I reorganized the household accounts to eliminate waste and redirect resources to those who needed them. I turned the unused East Wing into a refuge for women who had fallen on hard times, providing them with shelter and skills training and a path back to respectable employment. It was not the life I had imagined when I was a young girl dreaming of the future. But it was a good life, a meaningful life, and I would not have traded it for anything. The scandal that had nearly destroyed me gradually faded from public memory. Other scandals took its place, as they always do. The whispers about the murderess who had married the Duke gave way to newer, more exciting gossip about other people's misfortunes. But I did not forget. I could not forget. The memory of those dark days when I had been alone and condemned and utterly without hope remained with me always. It made me appreciate what I had found with Benedict all the more keenly. It made me determined to use my restored position to help others who had been similarly cast out. 3 years into our marriage, I received a letter that brought me unexpected closure. The Dowager Theodora had died in her sleep, peacefully and without pain. Among her possessions, her lady's maid had found a journal filled with confessions that the Dowager had never intended to be read. In it, she admitted everything: her hatred of me from the moment of my engagement to Phineas, her determination to see me destroyed after his death, her fabrication of the poison rumors, carefully seeded among her most gossipy acquaintances, her pressure on the family solicitor to ensure that I was removed from the estate as quickly as possible. But there was something else in that journal, something I had not expected: regret. In her final entries, written in a shaky hand that betrayed her declining health, she confessed that she had been wrong, that she had let her grief over losing Phineas transform into cruelty toward the woman he had loved, that she wished she could take it all back, but knew that some wounds could never be healed. I read those words with tears streaming down my face. Not tears of anger or vindication, but tears of something more complex, something that might have been compassion for a woman who had spent her final years consumed by bitterness of her own making. I showed the journal to Benedict. He read it in silence, his jaw tight, his eyes dark with emotions I could not name. "What would you like to do with this?" he asked when he had finished. I thought about it for a long moment. "Nothing," I said finally. "She is dead. Publishing her confessions would only cause more pain. And besides, I have already found my justice." He looked at me, a question in his eyes. "My justice," I said, "is this: our life, our love, the happiness we have built together. That is my vindication. That is my triumph." He pulled me into his arms and held me close. "You are a remarkable woman," he murmured into my hair. "I do not know what I did to deserve you. You walked through a blizzard to find me," I reminded him. "That is not nothing." He laughed, a sound that still had the power to fill me with joy after all our years together. The least I could do, he said, was meet you halfway. The years that followed were golden ones. Our marriage deepened and strengthened, weathering the inevitable storms that life brings. We faced losses and disappointments, challenges and setbacks. But through it all, we faced them together. Benedict continued to transform the estate into something he could be proud of. The school he had established grew into a proper academy, attracting students from miles around. The improvements to the tenant farms led to increased prosperity for the entire region. His reputation changed from the cold, unapproachable Duke to a man of vision and compassion, respected and admired by all who knew him. And I continued my work with the Women's Refuge, expanding it into a network of safe houses across the county. I corresponded with reformers and advocates, adding my voice to the growing calls for change. I used my position as Duchess to open doors that would have been closed to others, and I never forgot the lesson I had learned in my cottage. That kindness is the most powerful force in the world. But our greatest triumph, I think, was simply the life we built together. The quiet evenings by the fire, reading aloud as we had done in those first uncertain days. The walks through the hills, now so familiar that we could navigate them with our eyes closed. The conversations that stretched long into the night, covering every topic from philosophy to farming to the meaning of love. We never had children. It was a sorrow we carried quietly, a door that life had closed to us. But we filled our home with other forms of love. The women who passed through the refuge became like family, sending letters and visits and grateful acknowledgments for years after they had moved on to new lives. The villagers who had welcomed me when I was an outcast continued to treat us as their own. And the staff who served in our household became not servants, but friends, part of the extended family we had created together. When I look back on my life now, I am amazed at the turns it has taken. From the comfortable but unremarkable existence of my youth, to the quiet happiness of my first marriage, to the devastating fall that stripped me of everything I had known, to the unexpected redemption that came walking through a blizzard and into my door. I think of the woman I was when I first arrived at that cottage, broken and alone, convinced that my life was over. I think of the woman I became in those months of solitude, discovering a strength I had never known I possessed. And I think of the woman I am now, secure in love, fulfilled in purpose, grateful beyond measure for the journey that brought me here. The Duke's castle is warm now. The cold that once permeated its halls has been replaced by something better, not just the heat of well-tended fires, but the warmth of a home truly lived in. The walls that once kept everyone at bay have been torn down, replaced by open doors and welcoming arms. And the outcast's hut still stands at the edge of the estate, maintained carefully as a reminder of where we began. Benedict and I walk there sometimes, when we want to remember. We sit by the old fireplace, now updated but still recognizable, and we talk about those first days, those first tentative conversations, those first glimmers of something that would become the greatest love either of us had ever known. I learned to survive on silence and solitude, but I learned to live, truly live, only when I opened my door to a man who needed saving as much as I did. We saved each other. That is the truth at the heart of my story. Not a rescue by a noble hero or a transformation by a virtuous heroine, but a mutual awakening, a shared discovery, a love that grew from the most unlikely of beginnings. I am the Duchess of Ashworth now, but I will always remember that I was the outcast first. And sometimes, on winter nights when the wind howls outside and the fire crackles in the hearth, I close my eyes and I am back in that tiny cottage, alone but not afraid, waiting for the knock that would change everything. It came. He came. And because I opened the door, because I chose compassion over bitterness, because I allowed myself to believe in the possibility of redemption, I found something I had never dared to hope for. I found home. I found love. I found myself. And that, I have learned, is the greatest gift of all. The seasons turn, and still we remain. the Duke and the Outcast, the man who built walls of ice and the woman who taught him to feel. The two broken hearts that somehow found their way to wholeness. Our story is not a fairy tale. There is no magic, no supernatural intervention, no guarantee of perfect happiness. There are only two imperfect people making imperfect choices, learning and growing and failing and trying again. But perhaps that is what makes it real. Perhaps that is what makes it true. I was given a second chance when I thought all chances had been exhausted. I was offered warmth when I had resigned myself to cold. I was shown love when I had forgotten what love felt like. And in return, I gave the same gifts back. I opened my door to a stranger. I offered my fire to a frozen man. I shared my heart with someone who had forgotten he still had one. We were both saved. We were both redeemed. And in the end, that redemption was not something that happened to us, but something we created together, one small act of kindness at a time. The castle is warm now. The outcast's hut is a memory, and the Duke who once begged to enter has become the man who walks beside me through all the days of my life. This is my story. This is our story. And though I do not know what the future holds, I know this. Whatever comes, we will face it together. For that is what love means. Not grand gestures or perfect circumstances, but the simple commitment to keep walking forward, hand in hand, through storms and sunshine alike. The snow will come again, as it always does in these northern hills. The winds will howl, the cold will bite, and the world will be covered in white. But inside these walls, inside this life we have built together, there will be warmth. There will be light. There will be love. And that is enough. That is everything. That is home. I remember still the particular quality of light in my cottage during those first lonely months. It was a thin light, watery and pale, filtering through windows that I had cleaned until they sparkled, but which still seemed to hold the memory of years of neglect. I would wake before dawn, lying in my narrow bed, listening to the silence that was never truly silent, the creak of settling wood, the rustle of wind against the walls, the distant call of birds beginning their morning songs. In London, I had been accustomed to noise, the clatter of carriages on cobblestones, the shouts of street vendors, the constant murmur of a city that never truly slept. The silence of the countryside had been difficult at first, almost oppressive in its weight. But gradually I had come to appreciate it. In the silence, I could hear my own thoughts. In the silence, I could begin to understand who I was when stripped of all the roles I had played: wife, society lady, accused murderess. Those first weeks, I spoke to no one except the villagers I encountered during my necessary trips for supplies. I rationed my words as carefully as I rationed my food, knowing that both were precious commodities that I could not afford to waste. But the human heart is not designed for complete solitude, and as the autumn deepened into winter, I found myself growing hungry for connection in ways that surprised me. It was Theophilus who first broke through my self-imposed isolation. The old apothecary had taken it upon himself to check on me, appearing at my cottage one gray November morning with a basket of herbs and a worried expression. "You look thin," he said without preamble, his spectacles sliding down his nose as he peered at me, "and pale. Are you eating properly?" "I am fine," I said, the words coming automatically even as I recognized their falseness. He did not believe me, that much was clear. "Nevertheless, I have brought you some things: chamomile for sleep, peppermint for digestion, and this." He held up a small pot that smelled of something rich and savory. "My wife's rabbit stew. She worries about you." I had not met his wife, had not known until that moment that he even had one. But the gesture, so simple and so kind, broke something loose in my chest that I had been holding tight for weeks. "Thank you," I said, and my voice cracked on the words. Theophilus looked at me with eyes that had seen too much to be easily surprised by human sorrow. "You are welcome," he said simply. "Now, tell me about the books you have been reading. I could use some intellectual conversation. My wife is brilliant, but she has no patience for philosophy." And so began the first of many visits. Theophilus came once a week, sometimes twice, always bearing small gifts of food or medicine or simply his company. We talked about everything: the philosophical treatises I was reading, the history of the region, the properties of various herbs and their medicinal uses. He told me about his youth when he had trained in Edinburgh under a famous physician, and about his decision to return to this remote village to serve a community that could not afford the fees of more prestigious doctors. He never asked about the scandal. He never mentioned my husband or the accusations that had driven me from London. He treated me simply as a neighbor, a fellow human being worthy of respect and kindness. And that simple act of dignity was more healing than any medicine he could have prescribed. Through Theophilus, I came to know the other villagers. Cornelius the blacksmith, who spoke little but whose actions spoke volumes, always finding some excuse to check that my cottage was in good repair. Rosalind the baker's wife, who had a laugh like bells and a heart as warm as her ovens, who began including me in the village's small social gatherings despite the whispers that followed me wherever I went. Gideon the carpenter, who had lost his own wife to a winter fever 3 years prior, and who understood, without my having to explain, what it meant to rebuild a life from grief. These simple folk became my community, my family in a way that my blood relations had never been. They did not care that I had once moved in the highest circles of London society. They did not care that I had been accused of murder. They cared only that I was kind, that I worked hard, that I treated them with respect. And slowly, so slowly I almost did not notice it happening, the frozen places in my heart began to thaw. But there was another kind of education happening during those months, one that took place not in the cottage, but in the wilds around it. I had never been a particularly outdoorsy person in London. My walks in the park had been sedate affairs, more concerned with being seen than with actually experiencing nature. But here, with nothing but time and silence and the vast landscape stretching in every direction, I began to discover the natural world in a way I never had before. I learned the names of the birds that visited my garden, the bold robins with their red breasts, the chattering sparrows, the elegant thrushes with their spotted chests. I learned which mushrooms were safe to eat and which would make me ill. I learned to read the weather in the color of the sky and the direction of the wind, to predict storms before they arrived by the particular ache in my joints. I learned, too, the deeper rhythms of the land, the way the moors shifted color through the seasons, from the purple of summer heather to the brown of autumn bracken to the white of winter snow. The way the streams rose and fell with the rains, sometimes gentle trickles and sometimes rushing torrents. The way the hills seemed to breathe, expanding in the morning light and contracting in the shadows of evening. This was a wild place, beautiful and harsh in equal measure. It demanded respect. It did not care for titles or social standing or the petty concerns of human society. It simply was, ancient and indifferent, and in its indifference I found a strange comfort. I was small here. My troubles were small. The scandal that had consumed my life in London was nothing compared to the vast sweep of the moors, the ancient stones that had stood for thousands of years, the stars that wheeled overhead in patterns unchanged since the beginning of time. There was perspective in that smallness, a reminder that my suffering, however real, was but a single note in the great symphony of existence. This was the woman the Duke found when he stumbled to my door that frozen night. Not the broken creature who had fled London, but someone new, someone stronger, someone who had learned to survive not just physically, but spiritually, who had discovered reserves of resilience she had never known she possessed. I think that is why I was able to help him. I had walked through my own darkness and emerged, not unscathed, but transformed. I knew the landscape of grief and isolation as intimately as I knew the hills around my cottage. And when I looked at Benedict, shivering and desperate in my doorway, I recognized a fellow traveler, someone lost in the same wilderness I had navigated alone. The days immediately following his arrival were strange, almost dreamlike in their quality. Here was this man, this duke, this representative of everything that had destroyed my life, utterly dependent on my mercy. I could have turned him away. I could have let him freeze. Some would say I should have, that justice would have been served by leaving him to the consequences of his family's cruelty. But I had learned something in my months of solitude, something that went beyond mere survival. I had learned that bitterness is a poison that harms the one who carries it far more than the one it is directed at. I had learned that kindness is not weakness, but strength, the choice to be better than those who have hurt you. And I had learned that every person, no matter how cold or distant they appear, carries wounds that others cannot see. So I brought him inside. I warmed him and fed him and gave him shelter. And in doing so, I discovered that healing another can also heal oneself. Those first conversations between us were careful, tentative things. We circled each other like wary animals, uncertain of the other's intentions, unwilling to show vulnerability. He was formal, almost stiff, using my title and maintaining the distance his position demanded. I was polite but guarded, offering hospitality without warmth, kindness without trust. But as the days passed and the storm raged outside, something began to shift. Perhaps it was the intimacy of the small space, the way the cottage forced us into constant proximity. Perhaps it was the vulnerability that illness and exhaustion had stripped from him, leaving him unable to maintain his usual defenses. Perhaps it was simply that we were both starved for genuine human connection and could not resist its pull. I remember the exact moment when things changed. It was the third night, and the storm was finally beginning to abate. He had recovered enough to sit up for extended periods, and we were sharing a simple meal of soup and bread when he suddenly set down his spoon and looked at me with an expression I could not read. "May I ask you something?" he said. I tensed, expecting an accusation, a demand to explain myself. "Of course. Why are you being kind to me?" The question caught me off guard. I had expected questions about the scandal, about my marriage to his brother, about the events that had led to my exile. I had not expected this. "Why would I not be?" I asked carefully. He was silent for a long moment, his gray eyes searching my face. "Because if our positions were reversed," he said slowly, "I do not know that I would extend the same courtesy. You have every reason to hate me, to wish me harm, and yet you have shown me nothing but hospitality." I considered my answer carefully. I could have given him a simple response, something about Christian charity or human decency, but something in his expression told me he was asking for something deeper, something true. When I first came here, I said, I was consumed by bitterness. I spent weeks raging at the injustice of my situation, at your family, at society, at God himself for allowing such cruelty to befall me. I wanted revenge. I wanted vindication. I wanted everyone who had wronged me to suffer as I had suffered. He did not speak, but I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps. But slowly I continued. I began to realize that my bitterness was not harming anyone but myself. The people who had destroyed my reputation were back in London, going about their lives, utterly untouched by my hatred. I was the only one being consumed by it. I was the only one suffering. I paused, gathering my thoughts, so I made a choice. I chose to let it go. Not to forgive exactly, not then, but to release the bitterness that was poisoning me. I chose to focus on building something new rather than mourning what I had lost. "And does it work?" he asked quietly. "Sometimes," I admitted. "Sometimes I still feel the anger, the injustice, the pain. But it is not the center of my existence anymore. I am more than what happened to me. I am more than the wrongs that were done to me." He was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was rougher than before. "I do not know if I could do the same," he said. "I have been carrying my bitterness for so long, I do not know who I would be without it." "You would be yourself," I said simply, "just lighter." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and something passed between us that I could not name. Not love, not yet, but something, a recognition, an understanding. From that night forward, our conversations deepened. We spoke of philosophy and literature, of art and music, of the great questions that have occupied human minds since the beginning of time. We debated the nature of justice and mercy, the balance between duty and desire, the possibility of redemption. But we also spoke of simpler things. I told him about my childhood, about my father who had encouraged my education despite the disapproval of society, about my mother who had died when I was young and whom I remembered only in fragments of memory, the smell of her perfume, the sound of her laughter, the warmth of her arms around me. He told me about his childhood at the estate, about the strict governesses and distant parents, about the younger brother who had been his closest companion until duty separated them. "There was Phineas," he said one evening, and his voice was soft with memory. "He was always the gentle one, the kind one. I used to protect him from the other boys at school, from our father's expectations, from the world that seemed determined to crush his sensitive spirit." "You loved him," I said, "more than I knew how to show." He paused, his jaw tightening. "I was always the one who had to be strong, to be capable, to be the heir. There was no room for tenderness in my life. But Phineas was allowed to be soft, and I think part of me envied him for it." "Is that why you never visited us after we married?" I asked. I had wondered about it at the time, the conspicuous absence of the brother who had supposedly been so close. He was silent for a long moment. "I could not bear to see him happy," he finally admitted, "to see him building the life I thought I would have with Christabel. Every time I thought of visiting, I imagined watching you together, seeing the love in his eyes, and I could not." "It was not personal," I said. "You did not even know me." "No," he agreed. "It was not about you at all. It was about me and my inability to be happy for my own brother, another mark against my character." "You were grieving," I said gently. "Grief does strange things to people." He looked at me with something like wonder. "How do you do that?" he asked. "Do what?" "See the good in people, even those who do not deserve it." I thought about his question, about the journey that had brought me to this place of hard-won peace. "I suppose," I said slowly, "I have learned that most people are not villains. They are simply people, flawed and struggling, doing the best they can with what they have. Even those who hurt us are usually acting out of their own pain, their own fear, their own wounds." "Even my mother?" he asked, and there was a challenge in his voice. "Even your mother," I said. "I do not know her story, but I suspect there are chapters I have never read. People do not become bitter and cruel without reason." He was silent, processing this. "That does not excuse what she did to you," he said finally. "No," I agreed, "but it helps me to not hate her, and that helps me, even if it does nothing for her." The storm passed on the fourth day, and with its passing came the practical reality of our situation. He could not stay in my cottage indefinitely, not without causing scandal. And he had responsibilities at the estate, repairs to oversee, a household to manage. But something had shifted between us, something that neither of us was willing to give a name to yet. We had become more than strangers, more than reluctant host and unexpected guest. We had become something like friends. He left on the fifth morning, walking back through the now manageable snow to the castle that awaited him. But before he went, he stood in my doorway and looked at me with those gray eyes that no longer seemed cold. "May I call on you?" he asked, "when the weather permits, to continue our conversations?" I felt something flutter in my chest, a sensation I had not experienced since Phineas's early courtship. "I would like that," I said. And so began the strangest courtship of my life. Not that either of us called it that, not at first. He came twice a week, walking the distance from the castle to my cottage, regardless of weather. We talked and read and walked the hills together, and with each visit, the walls between us grew a little thinner. I learned more of his story during those weeks, how he had been molded from birth to be the perfect heir, emotion beaten out of him by a father who believed that feeling was weakness, how he had found solace in his studies, retreating into the world of books and ideas where he could think and feel without judgment, how meeting Christabel had been like stepping into sunlight after years in a dark room, and how her death had sent him back into the darkness, this time with the determination never to emerge. "I have been living half a life," he told me one afternoon as we walked along a frozen stream, "going through the motions, fulfilling my duties, but never truly present. It was easier that way. If you do not allow yourself to feel, you cannot be hurt. But you also cannot be healed," I said. He stopped walking and turned to face me. "No," he agreed, "you cannot." The look in his eyes in that moment was almost too much to bear. So much longing, so much fear, so much hope struggling against the walls he had built. I reached out and took his hand. It was a small gesture, but it felt momentous. The first physical contact between us since those desperate hours when I had pulled him from the cold. He looked down at our joined hands, and I saw his throat work as he swallowed. "Honoria," he said, and my name on his lips sounded like a prayer. "Benedict," I responded, and I felt him shiver at the intimacy of his Christian name. We stood there in the frozen landscape, two wounded souls holding on to each other as if we might otherwise blow away in the wind. And in that moment, I knew that whatever this was between us, it was something real, something worth fighting for. The spring came slowly, grudgingly, as if the land itself was reluctant to release its grip on winter. But eventually the snow retreated, the streams swelled with meltwater, and the first green shoots began to push through the brown earth. With the changing season came a change in our relationship. Benedict began speaking of the future, of plans that included me in ways that were unmistakable. He wanted me to see the improvements he was making to the estate. He wanted my opinion on everything from paint colors to agricultural techniques. He wanted me in his life, not as an occasional visitor, but as a constant presence. The proposal came on a rainy April evening. We were in my cottage, the fire crackling, rain drumming against the windows. He had been unusually quiet all evening, fidgeting with his teacup, unable to settle. Finally, he set down his cup and stood, pacing to the window and back. "There is something I must say to you," he began, and his voice was thick with nerves. I waited, my heart beating faster than it had any right to. "I know that I have no right to ask anything of you," he continued. "After everything my family has done, after the suffering we have caused you, I should expect nothing." And yet, he stopped pacing and turned to face me, his expression more vulnerable than I had ever seen it. "And yet I find that I cannot keep silent any longer. Honoria, you have become the most important person in my life. Your wisdom, your kindness, your strength, everything about you has made me want to be a better man. I love you. I have loved you for longer than I knew how to admit, even to myself." He crossed the room in 2 strides and knelt before my chair, taking my hands in his. "I am asking you to be my wife," he said. "Not because of duty or obligation or society's expectations, but because I cannot imagine my life without you. I am asking you to take a broken man and help him become whole." I looked into his eyes, those gray eyes that had once seemed so cold and now blazed with warmth. I thought of all the reasons I should refuse, the scandal it would cause, the whispers that would follow, the difficulty of stepping back into a world that had cast me out. And then I thought of him, of the man he had been and the man he was becoming, of the love he was offering freely and without condition. "Yes," I said. "Yes, I will marry you." The joy that transformed his face was like watching the sun break through storm clouds. He gathered me into his arms and held me close, and I felt the trembling of his body as years of repressed emotion finally found release. "I was afraid," he whispered into my hair. "I was so afraid you would say no." "Did you really think I would?" I asked. He pulled back to look at me, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I think I was afraid to hope," he said. "Hope has not been kind to me in the past." I cupped his face in my hands. "Then let us build a new hope together," I said, "one that will not disappoint." He kissed me then, soft and sweet and full of promise. And in that kiss, I felt the beginning of everything. Our wedding was small, as I described before, but what I did not mention was the joy. The pure, uncomplicated joy of standing before our small gathering of friends and pledging ourselves to each other. The way Benedict's voice broke as he spoke his vows, the way my hands trembled as I placed my ring on his finger, the way we looked at each other as we were pronounced husband and wife, and saw in each other's eyes the reflection of our own wonder and gratitude. The reception was held in my cottage, that small space that had sheltered me through my darkest days. We had decorated it with wildflowers gathered from the hills, and Rosalind had baked a wedding cake that was simpler than any society bride would have accepted, but more delicious than anything I had ever tasted. I remember dancing with Benedict in the tiny kitchen, no music, but the tune he hummed in my ear. I remember the toasts raised by our friends, sincere and heartfelt. I remember the moment when we finally closed the door on the last of our guests and stood alone together, husband and wife. "Are you happy?" he asked, his arms around me, his chin resting on the top of my head. "Beyond measure," I said. "And you." "I did not know happiness like this was possible," he admitted. "I had given up hoping for it." We stood there in the firelight, holding each other, and I felt a peace settle over me that I had never known before. All the pain, all the struggle, all the darkness I had walked through had led me to this moment. And looking back, I could not regret any of it, because it had brought me here. The years since our wedding have been full ones, rich with the daily pleasures of a shared life. We have weathered challenges together, the minor disagreements and major crises that every marriage must face. We have celebrated triumphs and mourned losses. We have grown and changed, both individually and together, becoming people we would not have recognized when we first met. But through it all, the foundation of our love has remained strong. The connection we forged in that frozen winter, tested by circumstance and deepened by time, has proven unbreakable. We are partners in every sense of the word, sharing not just a home and a bed, but a life's purpose. I think sometimes of the woman I might have been if things had happened differently, if the scandal had never occurred. If I had remained in London, a respected widow, perhaps eventually remarrying someone suitable and settling into a comfortable but unremarkable existence. I do not envy that woman. She would never have known the depths of despair I experienced, but she would also never have known the heights of joy. She would never have been stripped down to her essential self and forced to rebuild from the foundations. She would never have discovered the strength she was capable of, or the love she deserved. Suffering is not a gift. I would not wish the pain I endured on anyone, but I have learned that even from the darkest experiences, something valuable can be salvaged: wisdom, compassion, resilience, gratitude for simple things that might otherwise be taken for granted. Benedict and I speak of this sometimes, in the quiet hours of the evening when the fire burns low and the house settles around us. We speak of how our greatest pain became the pathway to our greatest joy. We speak of the mysterious alchemy that transformed two broken people into something whole. We do not understand it, not fully, but we are grateful for it every day. The cottage still stands at the edge of the estate. We visited together on the anniversary of that frozen night when Benedict came to my door, walking the path he walked through the blizzard, remembering. The building has been restored now, updated with modern conveniences while preserving its essential character. It serves as a guest house for visitors who need a quiet retreat, and for us, it serves as a reminder that hope can be found in the darkest places, that love can bloom in the coldest ground, that every ending is also a beginning if we have the courage to see it. I am old now, older than I ever expected to be. The beauty of my youth has faded, replaced by the weathered elegance of age. My hands are lined, my hair is silver, and my joints ache on rainy days. But when Benedict looks at me, I still see in his eyes the same wonder I saw on our wedding day. And when I look at him, silver-haired and distinguished, still handsome in the way that good men become more handsome with age, I feel my heart swell with the same love that has sustained me for decades. We have been blessed. I know this. Not everyone who suffers finds redemption. Not every love story ends happily. We are the lucky ones, the exceptions to a rule that often seems cruel and arbitrary. But perhaps luck is not the right word. Perhaps it was something else. Perhaps it was the accumulation of small choices, each one steering us closer to each other. My choice to open my door, his choice to walk through the storm, our choice to be vulnerable, to trust, to love. We chose each other. Again and again, through every difficulty and every doubt, we chose each other. And in choosing, we created something that neither of us could have built alone. That, I think, is the secret. Not grand gestures or perfect circumstances, but the daily choice to show up, to be present, to love even when it is difficult. The willingness to see the best in another person, even when they struggle to see it in themselves. The commitment to grow together, to change together, to become together more than either could be apart. I do not know how much time we have left. I do not know what the future holds, but I know this. Whatever comes, we will face it together, and that is enough. That is everything. The fire burns low in the grate, and outside my window, snow is beginning to fall. Another winter approaching, another season in the endless cycle that has marked my life. I watch the flakes drift past the glass, each one unique, each one beautiful, each one destined to become part of something larger than itself. I hear Benedict's footsteps in the hall, his familiar tread approaching. In a moment, he will appear in the doorway, and his face will light up when he sees me, as it has every day for all these years. He will cross the room and take my hand, and we will sit together in companionable silence, watching the snow fall, grateful for the warmth of our home and the love that fills it. This is my life. This is our life. A story that began in darkness and found its way to light. A story of loss and redemption, of despair and hope, of a castle that turned to ice and an outcast's hut that was warm. He came to my door on a frozen night, begging to enter. I let him in, and everything changed. Everything continues to change, even now. That is the nature of life, of love, of the human heart. We are never finished becoming who we are meant to be. But I know, with a certainty that goes beyond words, that whoever I continue to become, I will become it with him, and he with me. Together, always. That is our story. That is our truth. That is the ending that is also a beginning, the conclusion that opens onto eternity. I am Honoria Ashworth, Duchess and Outcast, widow and wife, lost and found. And I am home. There is one more thing I must tell you, before I lay down my pen and let this story find its way into the world. One more truth that has taken me a lifetime to understand. When I was young, I believed that love was something that happened to you. A lightning bolt from the heavens. An uncontrollable force that swept you off your feet and carried you to happiness or ruin. I believed that the poets were right, that love was madness and passion and consuming fire. I know now that the poets were only half right. Love is a choice. It is 1,000 choices, made daily, hourly, in moments large and small. It is the choice to be patient when patience is difficult, the choice to forgive when forgiveness seems impossible, the choice to see the person before you clearly, with all their flaws and failures, and to love them not despite those imperfections, but because of them, because they are part of the whole, part of the truth. Benedict taught me this, or rather, we taught each other. In the long years of our marriage, we have had ample opportunity to choose kindness over irritation, to choose understanding over judgment, to choose presence over withdrawal. We have not always chosen well. There have been moments when anger won over compassion, when pride trumped humility, when the walls between us seemed as high as they had ever been. Marriage is not a fairy tale, and even the deepest love is tested by the grinding reality of daily life. But in the end, we have always found our way back to each other. We have always made the choice that matters most, the choice to stay, to keep trying, to believe in what we have built together even when it seems fragile, even when it seems endangered. That is the lesson I want to leave behind. Not that love conquers all, for that is too simple, too easy, but that love is worth fighting for, that it requires effort and intention and courage, that it is not a destination, but a journey, one that has no ending, only new beginnings. The fire burns low, the snow continues to fall, and somewhere in this great house that has become my home, I hear the footsteps of the man I love coming to find me as he has found me every day for all these years. I close my eyes and remember the night he came to my door, the desperation in his face, the ice in his hair, the way he fell to his knees in the snow, too proud to ask for help and too cold to pretend he did not need it. I remember the choice I made in that moment, the choice to open my door, my heart, my life. It was the best choice I ever made, and if I had to do it all again, if I had to walk through all the darkness and all the pain to arrive at this moment, I would. Without hesitation, without regret, with love, always with love.